Welcome to Faith Arts, everyone. I'm Lorenda Harder, creator of Faith Arts, and I'm really glad you made it here this evening to enjoy our discussion. And what we do is we're an inter-church group, and we are artists or art appreciators. And by art, I mean we might be writers or visual artists or dramatists or photographers or any number of artists. So, and we really hope that our discussion tonight is really applicable to your life. Today, our literary author, Deb Elkink, will be presenting our topic for tonight, and it's called When Myth Became Fact, and it's based on some of C.S. Lewis's writings, and it's about the incarnation as our inspiration. And we're really looking forward to this. Thank you, Deb, for taking this discussion, and welcome.
Thanks a lot, Lorenda. I'm glad to be here. This is quite a chewy subject, isn't it? When myth became fact, the incarnation as our inspiration. If you do any reading on C.S. Lewis and his view of truth, his view of myth, which would be an extensive study, you might find that it's not actually very simple and even somewhat challenging. I find it that way. The question of Lewis and myth can become pretty complicated pretty quickly, especially as looked at from the biblical viewpoint that might first consider the literary inerrancy and historical accuracy of the Bible. So if you're starting from a position of literacy, literal inerrancy and historical accuracy, which I do, that can seem to challenge the idea of mythologies generally. In order to understand this subject holistically, really, we should do a full study. We're not going to, but we should do a full study on what the Bible has to say about mythologies. So instead of that, let's just look for a moment at 2 Peter 1:16, and I'll quote that to you. For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. The principle behind this verse is that the Bible is based on historical facts, not myths. So we don't have the time or even really the desire tonight or today to do such an expositional study. That's not the purpose here. But feel free to take some time after this session to look at the number 1 under the supplemental notes, either in your chat, or if you're listening to this later, the supplemental notes that will be posted on the website. So this is a very good verse-by-verse expository study on this verse in 2 Peter. So that's just stated right out. We'll put that out there, and then we'll take a look at how Lewis was looking at it, because Lewis's arguments come from a completely different place than a verse-by-verse exposition of Scripture, let alone 2 Peter. We don't have time today to get deeply into the theological, even philosophical, even literary question of what constitutes myth, although we've been having a pretty lively discussion lately on our Facebook group, which I recommend anybody come and join, because it's been quite interesting. So instead, we're going to look broadly as artists and art appreciators at Lewis's general idea of myth becoming fact, and ask ourselves how the incarnation can be our inspiration. Well, the first Lewis excerpt I'd like you to consider with me is from the book God in the Dock, Lewis's book, and he wrote one chapter entitled Myth Became Fact, which is, of course, where the title for this talk today comes from. So it's just a small portion of that. But let me read along with you, and we'll just kind of take a look at what we've got on under number 2, and going over to the next long quote down. Now, As myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heavens of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris, dying nobody knows where or when, to a historical person crucified. It is all in order, under Pontius Pilate. By becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That's the miracle. God is more than God, not less. Christ is more than Balder, not less. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous about parallels and pagan Christs. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to be mythopoeic, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, and the poet in each one of us, no less than to the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. So that's the end of the first quote or excerpt that I took from Lewis's writing. So let's look first for some definitions of myth. I had to figure out how to say mythopoeic. I had to listen online because it's spelled so strangely. So first of all, we're going to look at the word myth. And I know on our discussion online, we were talking about, there are many definitions for myth. Well, I appeal to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is like almost inspired. And I will tell you that they have two views of myth, two definitions. One is that it's a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. The second version is a widely held but false belief or idea, misrepresentation of truth, imagery or fictitious story, or an exaggerated or idealized conception of something. So there's no idea of truth in them. There's no discussion of truth or fact in them. They're actually until we look at C.S. Lewis, myth is considered not fact, the opposite of fact, according to OED. So all the dictionaries that I looked at saw as a core part of myth the not true aspect of myth. In the context of C.S. Lewis's quote, though, we see that he does not really mean by myth what this dictionary tells us. He's going to redefine it. Lewis says in our reading, you can see it there if you look up, the heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. That is the incarnation. He says, by becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle. So Lewis is saying that myth became a fact in and through the miracle of the incarnation. The incarnation, a one and only event that is not repeatable. God taking on flesh, Jesus becoming the God-man. So that is the myth of the dying and resurrecting gods that we see throughout mythology, Balder of Norse mythology, Osiris of Egyptian mythology, he mentions them. This shows human longing. The fact of the incarnation miracle doesn't do away with the longing behind the myth. It fulfills it. Lewis believed that the Christian story is the greatest story of all stories ever told, because it is the real story, the historical event that fulfills all the fairy tales and shows us what they mean. So I'm referring again to excerpt 2, Lewis used only another two words that need a little unpacking. Of course, it's, if God chooses to be mythopoeic and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? Mythopoeic is of or relating to the making of myth. Mythopoeic. As a mythopoeic artist, you are dipping into myth. Myth is a part of or something that your art refers to in some way or another. Mythopathic, that means the state of being receptive to myth, receiving nourishment and understanding from stories such as Tolkien's work, or of course C.S. Lewis's. So let's add to the mix another Lewis quote from a letter he wrote. You can go down to number 3 here. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth, where the others are men's myths. That is, the pagan stories are God expressing himself through the minds of poets, such as images, using such images as he found there. While Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things. This is a quote from Lewis in a letter to Greaves, which these letters have been collected. So that's where I got that one. So Lewis's idea here was that Christianity is the great embodiment of myth, and that all the myths are just prefigures, images, representations of the fact and truth of the incarnation. So I believe from what Lewis is saying in our quotes here. Now, remember, I didn't do a thorough, you guys may have read much more than I have in this, and almost certainly you have. But I believe from what I have looked at, that our own art need not be confined only to fact without myth. That our own poetry and story and painting need not do away with the other aspect, the moralism, scholarship, and philosophy, or the idea of myth. Both approaches are warranted, and usually we Christians dip into both of these aspects of myth and moralism, or some sort of scholarship or ideology of philosophy of some sort that we're trying to get across or that we're working out of. So we don't need to negate myth because of that. One more point of definition before we begin our discussion is made by, this was interesting, I looked this up, the Mythopoeic Society. Note, number 4, note my summary of what the society, I have no idea where they're actually coming from, but I really like their definition here. This is my summary of it, but number 4, mythopoeic art has mythological elements that influence the spiritual, moral, or creative lives of the characters, subjects, or products of an artist's imagination. And also, mythopoeic art reflects and supports the author's or artist's underlying themes, inspiring the viewer or reader to examine the importance of mythology in his or her own spiritual, moral, and creative development. This is such a good quote. I mean, I'm going to keep these around for myself to read so that I can consider them more and more, because this gives me a guideline. So remember that the title of this talk is When Myth Became Fact, the Incarnation as Our Inspiration. Okay, So how does our art, or the art we appreciate, reflect the incarnation? How can the incarnation become our inspiration? How do I write story inspired by the incarnation? How do you paint a picture or write a script or work on whatever art or art appreciation? How do you appreciate a piece of art, seeing the incarnation becoming our inspiration? So I've got 3 questions for us to look at that might be discussion starters. I'll read them. A, do you accept the idea, which is presented here, that the incarnation, which is God in flesh, can inspire art? B, how does the fact of God becoming man and retaining his godhood inspire your art? C, where does the incarnation, that is Jesus, God in flesh, where does the incarnation, that is Jesus, God in spirit, taking on flesh by becoming God-man, where does the incarnation intersect with our art? Does small I incarnation as an arts concept mean an artist's themes are reflected in the art as we use a small I incarnation, as I write a character, making the character up in my fictive imagination? How do I incorporate the idea of small I incarnation? And does it mean that my themes are reflected in the art? Is that what this question is getting at? Or what do you think about that? Can our Christian beliefs equally take on paint, words, story? I have heard a particular very intimate artist friend of mine say, what I was going to say. Can our Christian beliefs equally take on paint, words, story? She's a visual artist, and she says, sometimes I just want to put words in my picture, put words in there so they understand what I'm saying, where I'm going. Sometimes as a verbal artist, as a writer, I want to put pictures I want to put illustrations. I want somebody to come along and put illustrations, but how do we show our influence of the incarnation in our work? That is the place that will start our discussion now. Thank you. All right, girls and gentlemen and ladies, girls and boys.
Let's start with the first one. So
okay.
Do you accept the idea here that the incarnation, God in flesh, can inspire art?
Yes.
Start with an easy one, huh?
I feel like there's 2 different ways you could look at that question. One, looking at, does like the act of incarnation affect how you view your art as like your creator to creation relationship? Do you compare that to like God's creator to us as his creation relationship, that he came down and was close and in us? And that's something I haven't thought. That's a big question that I haven't thought about before. So I feel like there's a limit, because there is a distinction between our relationship to what we create. I mean, sometimes I do feel that way. It can help me understand God's love. And for me is like looking at this, like, I don't know, whatever, this thing that I've made, and I love it because I've made it. And even if it has flaws or whatever, or it's in progress, that I do kind of feel that might give me a glimpse, but I feel like that still is, God is a much better creator. So there's a whole other dynamic to like his relationship with us. And I feel like there isn't the same sense that we put ourselves into art, that he put himself into this history. But I think that is an interesting idea to contemplate, and maybe there is more to it that I'm seeing right now. I guess the other thing is we're telling the story of the incarnation. That there's so much that wrapped up in that, but like, well, telling the story of love, or tell there's that trope of the king disguised among his own people, and going about as a commoner, and that's like a great thing in a lot of different stories. Aragorn is one of those, so yeah, you can see that element of it, but there's so many different elements of the incarnation, that you might see reflected in other stories. The self-sacrifice, it depends if we're just saying God becoming human, or if we're doing the whole story of what he did and why he became human, then that's very broad. And there's a lot of different ways that could come into your art. But just, I guess the beauty of a creator who loves is something that could be reflected or depicted or inspiring to, like, that's very broad, very, very broad of what that could draw out.
Thanks, Sarah. That's very good. You brought up you've crystallized several ideas there, and thank you very much for doing that. That stimulates us. Does somebody else have a comment that they'd like to make? And it doesn't need to be about this question. It could be about something else, but
I would like to say something. I just did a painting today, and the reason I did it, I called it Father's Love. And I'll show it to you in a minute, but it's a father holding his daughter. And Lorenda, you might recognize the fellow because I took a picture of them in church because of how he just loves his daughter. And I wanted to show my children that this is how God views them, and he wants them to rest like the daughter is. But I was just thinking, so I don't know if this is a stretch, but if Christ hadn't come in the flesh, how could we possibly have a grasp of what God would look like? I mean, I know he said we're made in his image, but theologians have said not the physical, rather the spiritual image is him, not the physical. So, that could get a person quite confused the more you look into it. But him actually coming in the flesh, does it lend more to my children to know that when Jesus has come in the flesh, and I'll show you the picture, that he would want us to be as relaxed as his child is in his arms. Well, if we didn't have him in the flesh,
if you could wait a minute, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is a picture that she is showing us right now of a man holding a young baby, and so this won't be showing on the audio, but you can probably imagine it. So
yeah. And so we'd like to see it again, Elizabeth, maybe a little bit later during we've done our recording. But you did give us a good idea. Okay, excellent. Very interesting point, Elizabeth. So you're discussing the actual physicality of the incarnation. So important. Lori,
he's reachable.
Yeah,
he's actually reachable. He's not just something out there. That when I do that painting, it's like, well, I'm not talking about a formless God, or if you look at Lovecraft, okay, Lovecraft, I feel like was a brilliant person who went insane because he didn't have Christ. When he describes gods, they're horrific, disgusting, huge beings. We don't have that because we had a God who came down to meet us.
That's great, Elizabeth. And as speaking about it from a theological viewpoint, we understand that Jesus was fully man and fully God. And I don't know, I agree with you. I don't know if there would have been another way that God could have reached us. Yes, Lorenda.
No, finish what you're saying first.
That was it. No, that
okay.
was it.
What Lizzie Jane said, and Sarah too, I was thinking about what was so significant for me when I was a young teenager. The fact that I knew that Jesus had real feet and walked on the beach called Galilee, it really made an impression on me. I connected in a very, like, kind of a physical way. I knew that he had been born, and that that was significant. And in terms of my art, I think it speaks to my art all the time. I mean, it's the reason I think I feel I can express like any beauty from nature in any way I want, because Jesus was flesh, that there was like he ate oats and he fried fish, and he had that everyday thing about him. So my art can be just its everyday art, and somehow it can somehow reflect the incarnation, because he managed to in his flesh reflect the incarnation in the perfect way. And so if I can reflect a bit of who he was and is, then that would be great. So yeah, thanks for sharing that before. It was really interesting.
Thank you so much, Lorenda.
And that's how I think we can incorporate incarnation into our art, because it shows up in those different themes, right? Because we can relate to Jesus and his earthly existence. We can find inspiration in that. Like, for example, when we are experiencing pain, we know he experienced it too. And we can then explore it in our poetry, in storytelling, in visual art. And those themes often show up in our art. And not only in our art, but in world literature, we see all those themes of rebirth, of transformation, of healing from deep pain.
Thank you so much, Adita. Yes, that's excellent. Good point. Been going on for a long time, the idea of art expressing truths.
I see art, the making of art, the actual doing part, not necessarily the end result always, although the end result is wonderful, right? But the act of making art, whatever kind of art you are making, is an act of exploration and trying to understand something. And I think our whole existence of humanity and trying to understand what we've lost and the grief we experience when our relationship with God in the Garden of Eden was ripped. It left this deep grief. And when you grieve, you have to walk through that grief, and it's a battle of understanding all of these emotions and things. And then comes healing, right? And so I see art as an act of exploration, of understanding, of grieving, of healing, but also trying to understand who we are, because that connection with God, with our maker, has been severed. And so we no longer have that understanding of what exactly does it mean to be human, to be fully human, right? We've been broken. We're not as we were supposed to be. And when Christ came in the incarnate, in flesh, fully God and fully man, he gave us a representation of wholeness that we didn't have for all of those years. And so when we reach beyond the physical in our art making, and we reach for all of those words that I don't understand, the spiritual things, we are reaching for him and grasping and trying to understand how that relationship between the physical and the spiritual works again, right? And again, it's so much and it's so big, and all of these things that we've read today, like I really don't understand most of it. I can't. But that's what I see it as, and that's how I think the incarnation can inspire us in our art. That's how I believe it inspires me in my art, because art is not, it's not just for the fact of making a thing. It is for experiencing the act of doing. And it teaches us something. And I think that experience is different for everybody, in what they're struggling with to understand.
Thanks, Mary. That's excellent. Mary Grace. Well, let's just add this little aspect in. What is with this myth thing then? What is with the myth things? We've talked about the incarnation. We get it. We get basic what the incarnation was. We kind of got it figured out what inspiration means to us. We've talked about that anyway on other programs. But what about myth? Like, where's that coming from? Where Lewis was saying myth came first into our pool of knowledge. Myth came first. What do you think? Anyone?
I see it as the deep longing of humanity for walking with God again. And so it's like you mentioned, right? In different cultures, it took different imagery and tone, but the idea was the same. There was a longing to be able to relate to God, and God becoming man like us was a way of realizing it, and it was kind of prophetic in human consciousness, like foreshadowing of what God would do. And we had it deep within us since our fall, since the garden, since the beginning, and it would show up in art and myth and stories we would tell.
Very good. That's really great. So we see myth, for example, we see in every culture, everybody knows about this one, but in every culture,
what you say, because then I'm starting to think about how that relates to now I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. Oh, our imaginations, right? And I think C.S. Lewis said something in the quote about our imagination, like we shouldn't be choking back our imagination. So those people with the longing before Christ came, they let their imaginations go wild and come up with these crazy myths, right? And I think that's a really neat concept. And Deb, you mentioned the word prefigured, that myth prefigures the incarnation, which I thought was pretty cool connection.
Thanks. I think I must have frozen at some point because I was talking. So one of the things that I was saying is we look at myths, look at the body of myths in any culture. And they say, what I've heard said is that, I don't know if this is true, maybe somebody else knows, but that in every culture, there's been a flood story. So this is not about incarnation, but it's about the flood. Does the myth reflect the flood that took place, and now it's become mythologized, and for people that say, yeah, but there's been a flood story in every myth. Well, yes, because there's an explanation from people who don't have the fact. There was a fact of a flood. There's a myth that's grown up around it, but in the same way, myths grow up more in many cultures. Like I just finished a story that's just being published this week, next week, about the way that Shinto used stories, myths, gods in order to explain the various occurrences in nature. And we see that in many cultures. So there'll be the culture that has to bring its grain offering or its child to the altar in order to make sure that life goes on or whatever. There's the stories about the gods as the stars in the sky, and how that explains. There's a need to understand. There's a need to explain. And so what Lewis is saying is that's okay. If there wasn't a need to explain, if there wasn't some sorts of explanation of the beautiful myths, there would be something wrong with the story. It's that human longing. It's a radiance, the radiance of the myths. Beautiful.
Yeah, and they do have kernels of truth in it. Like in the words of Tolkien, history became legend and legend became myth, right? With the passage of great time. So you can see it in the flood, right? It occurred And then as more and more time was passing, it became a legend. There was the core idea that there was this global flood. And then people, with the passage of time, would be adding to it stories, moving stories around it.
Just wanted to jump in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Like Tolkien keeps coming up. I'm probably more familiar with Tolkien than I am with C.S. Lewis, but like what you just said kind of struck a chord in me about, you know, like for instance, like one thing that I'm fascinated with is they have these like zones of safety, like Lorien and Rivendell, and already though, especially in Lorien, you have these gold trees, and it's just beautiful. I mean, it's colors like heaven, unimaginable, but yet it's the memory of those colors because everything's receding, the age is receding, the outer world is encroaching. Like right across the way, you can see the dead trees and the dead world, and then you're living in this bubble of memory. And so I'm very much interested in the idea of like safe havens and like I call them radiant zones, so like zones of
Beautiful.
safety and protection. And you know, it's just the same thing with like once they leave Middle Earth, or like say in the Hunger Games, like at the end she's talking to the baby and saying like one day I'll explain to you where these nightmares come from, but this child will grow up in a world where there's no more nightmares. Like they'll have no knowledge of what happened beforehand. Like so it's like another age. It's receding, and you know, it just slips. You know, in like you know, as like history slips into legend and then into myth. So yeah, I just find it very fascinating, all these parallels.
Yeah, it's very good. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate your contribution.
Yeah, I'm just getting my feet wet here. You know, it's my mind's like racing, and I don't know where exactly where to jump in. There's a lot of food for thought here. Like a lot of,
yes, there's a lot, and we're not trying to say anything definitively here. We're, as Mary Grace says, we're exploring with this. We're exploring. We're trying to keep certain things in mind in this this kind of a talk. We're trying to keep the fact that Christianity is solidly in place, and we're using that as a jumping off point. And particularly this year, we're using Lewis, but it's not that we think we're not necessarily always landing on Lewis. We're remembering that our landing pad is our sound faith in Christ, and then we're just exploring what these other things. This idea of myth is helpful to me because it kind of, you said something about radiance, which also Lewis had said something about radiance, and there's a sense of glory, or a sense of, anybody that creates something knows that. You make something, and you have the sense that it's beyond you. It's bigger than you. You didn't realize you could come up with something like this. You read it later on, or you take a look at your sewing project, or you look at a painting on the wall that you've hung, and you go, I can't believe I did that. I bet you all feel that way at some point or another. Lorenda.
Well,
this whole notion of radiance, I was thinking, and this kind of the zones of protection, I think of when I'm doing my own art, how safe I feel when I'm doing my own art, and this notion that maybe I'll even create something a little radiant, right? And then I was wondering about those cities of refuge in the Old Testament, and what connection that might have, and how that might speak to our art today. Does anyone have any ideas on that?
Well, those, if I'm correct, just off the cuff, those cities of refuge, were for sinners that were being chased so that they could be given their just deserts.
Or was it that they were being accused, but not necessarily guilty yet?
Even the guilty. If
Yeah,
they
the guilty.
there,
yeah.
If they ran there and they put their hands on the horns of the ark, or no, it wouldn't have been the ark, but the horns of
the altar.
Mercy.
But yeah, and it could be like if you'd accidentally cause someone harm, or for whatever reason, but their the Avenger of Blood, or whatever the title is, the person in their family who would come to avenge, you could come there and get a fair hearing, or it was a misunderstanding, or it was an accident, or those whatever, and then they might be brought to justice still, but they would get that refuge.
They would get that refuge and mercy and the space. They wouldn't be automatically killed or what. So that's so beautiful. And isn't it a lovely picture also of what a legal system should be and what the North American legal system has been built on? So that's great, Lori. That was a great question to Lorenda to bring that up. I never call her Lorenda. I call her Lori. So that's a good way to look back at scripture. We're seeing something from scripture. We're seeing it tying together. Any other ideas about this?
I have a story idea based on that, but within the story, it's like of the ruins of a city of refuge that people start coming to for refuge anyway. And then I think I have a poem version of part of it. I think I don't know where that is, but I've thought about different formats to try and tell that story. But.
Very nice. That's good. We'd love to hear more about it when you get it ready for showing us. That would be great. Now, I think we're about at our maximum. Is there another comment that anybody wants to make? Lorenda, did you have something to say about this? Anything to add? Okay. If you want to speak now. This is your last
forever
moment.
hold your peace.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that one thing that Robert said really came out to me. I love the idea that you put in my head, Robert, of the places in Lord of the Rings, the safe havens, as pockets of memory. Pockets of memory, and I see that as Tolkien's version of bringing a tiny bit of heaven, which was his, the Undying Lands, to Earth, which is, Middle Earth, and how even here in our real world, God has allowed pockets of refuge. And I think one thing would be I remember listening to a woman who went through the Holocaust, and then she was rescued, and she went to Sweden. And during the Second World War, Sweden was a pocket of refuge. It remained neutral. I hope I'm remembering that that's the right place.
Well,
she was asked. Yeah. She was asked once in this meeting that she was speaking of, did she ever think badly of the Swedes because they did not enter the fight? Her people were dying and they didn't come and help, right? And she said, if they had joined in the fight, where would I have gone? And so even in our reality, in the harsh realities of our real history, God makes pockets of refuge, little places of peace, and they change all the time. And right now, one thing I'm praying is that Canada, in the next whatever happens, can be a pocket of peace, that we can retain that somehow here for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
Refuge place, right?
Yeah.
A place where people can find freedom.
Yeah, and I think we have been for somebody, but anything. I just loved that idea, Robert. And I think that's a bit, pockets of peace, but that is bringing heaven, a little bit of heaven here to earth. The idea of peace and refuge. I just loved that. Thank you.
And specifically in our art and in our expression, that we could create that for people that need it. I think that's a beautiful thought.
Yes, and maybe that's a good way to close this discussion, thinking about the incarnation as our inspiration, the incarnation of Christ, coming to us to give us our eternal pocket of refuge, and that we can pass this along in whatever way through the mythology that we create with our own art. So thanks very much for giving such a lively display of discussion today. It was fun.
Thanks a lot, Deb. We really appreciate it. It was just so packed full of information. I always worry a little bit when you give a presentation because I'm hardly comprehending what you're saying right now. But somehow we're able to kind of unpack it, and you come up with these great questions and you draw us all out so beautifully. So thank you very much. And thank you all too for your additions. And even for those of you who are simply listening, and you're important to us as well. And we hope you can all join us next month for our next CF Lewis discussion. It's entitled The Mundane and the Miraculous, creatively portraying in the totality of life. So it's sort of a continuation of where we're leaving off today. Also, to find out about our artists, we have an Artists Need Artists network that we've started, and it can go anywhere in the world, and it's to encourage people to meet up in person, whatever town you're in. And so we encourage you to drop in at faitharts.org and find out about that, as well as there is an online art exhibit that's going to be that we're getting together and organizing, so you can find out about that. And like Deb said before, we encourage you to join the Faith Arts community Facebook group if you haven't already done so. So thanks a lot again for joining us today.